The name Kennedy is synonymous with American royalty. It evokes images of dazzling smiles, unrivaled political power, immense wealth, and a charisma that seemed almost otherworldly. They were the closest thing America ever had to a crown, a dynasty forged in ambition and baptized in the cold waters of the Atlantic. But for every moment of brilliant sunshine that bathed this family, a long, dark shadow was cast, a shadow that many believe is no mere coincidence of tragic fate, but something far more sinister, deliberate, and ancient. This is not just a story of political triumphs and personal failures. This is the story of what happens when a family makes a bargain with destiny, and destiny demands a terrible, generational price. This is the story of the Kennedy curse. Our story doesn't begin with a president, or a senator, or a war hero. It begins with an immigrant. Patrick Kennedy, a poor cooper from County Wexford, Ireland, fled the famine-ravaged fields of his homeland in 1849, seeking a new life in the promised land of Boston. He carried with him little more than the clothes on his back and the desperate hope that had fueled millions of Irish before him. He found work, married, and had a family. But the America he entered was one of deep-seated prejudice. The Boston Brahmin class looked down upon the Irish as drunken, unruly, and inferior. The No Irish Need Apply signs were not just slogans. They were barriers to a better life. Patrick died just a few years after arriving, likely from cholera, but the seed had been planted. His son, Patrick Joseph P.J. Kennedy, would be the one to water it with grit and political cunning. P.J. understood that in the crowded, ethnic neighborhoods of Boston, power wasn't given, it was taken. He worked as a stevedore, saved his money, and bought a saloon. Saloons were the nerve centers of immigrant communities, part social club, part political headquarters, part employment agency. From there, he built a political machine, becoming a ward boss, and eventually serving in the Massachusetts House of Representatives and Senate. The Kennedys were now on board. But it was PJ's son, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, who would look at the board and decide he wanted to own the entire game. Joe Kennedy was the architect of the dynasty we know today. He was a force of nature, ruthlessly ambitious and insatiably greedy. He made his first fortune in banking, then pivoted to Hollywood, where he not only made more money, but also had a very public, very messy affair with silent film star Gloria Swanson. He saw the stock market not as an investment tool, but as a casino he could rig, engaging in rampant insider trading and shady practices that would make him millions. He was a man who believed that rules were for other people. Most crucially, he understood that real, lasting power in America didn't reside solely in wealth, but in political influence. He became a key supporter of Franklin D. Roosevelt, dreaming of a cabinet position, perhaps even the presidency itself. But FDR was no one's puppet. He saw the opportunist in Kennedy, and after utilizing his support, ultimately sidelined him, appointing him as ambassador to the United Kingdom on the eve of World War II. It was there that Joe Kennedy's ambitions collided catastrophically with history. He was a staunch isolationist and an appeaser of Hitler, believing a war with Nazi Germany would be a disaster. He was famously quoted as saying, "Democracy is finished in England." His views were so out of step with the coming storm that they destroyed his political career. FDR recalled him in disgrace. The door to the highest office in the land, the prize he coveted above all else, was slammed shut in his face. This rejection did not soften Joe Kennedy, it hardened him. If he could not be president, then his sons would. He would live his ambition through them. He transferred his immense, crushing expectations onto his 4 boys, Joseph Jr., John, Robert, and Edward. They were to be his vessels, his instruments for achieving the ultimate power that had been denied to him. The training was relentless. Dinner table conversations were not about sports or girls. They were about geopolitics, economics, and public speaking. Second best was never an option. Winning was everything. It was in this crucible of immense pressure and privilege that the first major, chilling event of the curse would strike, seemingly targeting the very heir Joe had anointed. Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., was the golden boy, the firstborn, the one destined for greatness. Handsome, athletic, and embodying his father's ruthless drive, he was the chosen one. While his younger brother John, nicknamed Jack, was often sickly and bookish, Joe Jr. was the prototype of a future president. When World War II broke out, he enlisted as a naval aviator, his path seemingly a straight line to heroism. And then the White House. But on August 12, 1944, he volunteered for a near-suicidal secret mission, codenamed Project Anvil. The plan was to pack a remote-controlled bomber with 10 tons of high explosives, have the crew bail out over England, and then guide the plane to crash into a German V-3 cannon site in France. Joe Jr. and his co-pilot were in the aircraft as it climbed over the English Channel. They were supposed to arm the explosives and then parachute to safety. They never got the chance. The volatile payload detonated prematurely, vaporizing the plane and its 2 crewmen. No identifiable remains were ever found. Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., the family's great hope, was obliterated at the age of 29. For the family, the grief was immeasurable. For the patriarch, Joe, it was also a strategic catastrophe. His perfect plan had been shattered. In his profound grief, a dark legend began to take root. Some whispered that the family was being punished for the ruthless, cutthroat way Joe Kennedy had built his fortune. Others spoke of an old Irish folktale, a curse placed upon a family that rises too high, too fast. But Joe Kennedy was not a man to be deterred by superstition. He had a spare. The mantle of expectation, heavy and now tinged with death, fell onto the slender, ailing shoulders of his second son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And it's right here, as we see the weight of a dynasty shift in the wake of a horrific tragedy, that I want to take a moment to connect with you, the real investigators of this story. The Kennedy curse is a global mystery, and I'm fascinated by where its story is being heard. So, if you're gripped by this tale of power and doom, please do show the channel some support. Leave a like if you want to unravel this mystery with me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter, where we dive into Jack's rise and the first of his many brushes with death. And crucially, drop a comment below. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There's something powerful about knowing this story is being pieced together across different time zones. Now back to the shadow falling on Jack. The death of his brother was a defining, searing moment for John F. Kennedy. He was now the heir. The path his father had carved was now his to walk, whether he wanted to or not. The sickly boy who had spent much of his childhood in hospital beds, who had read voraciously about history and heroism, now had to become the hero himself. He entered politics, running for Congress in 1946. He was young, handsome, and a war hero in his own right, thanks to the dramatic sinking of his PT-109 boat in the Pacific. The Kennedy machine, built by his grandfather and supercharged by his father, went into overdrive. He won. The climb had begun. But the curse, it seemed, was just getting warmed up. As JFK ascended, the near misses and personal tragedies began to multiply around him, a haunting drumbeat accompanying his march to power. His sister, Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy, had been the vibrant, rebellious heart of the family, defying her family's strict Catholic expectations. She had married William Billy Cavendish, the Marquis of Hartington and heir to the Duke of Devonshire, an Anglican. The marriage caused a scandal, and the family, particularly her mother Rose, was deeply disapproving. Just months after their wedding, Billy was killed by a German sniper in Belgium in 1944. Kick, now a widow at 24, remained in England, trying to build a new life. 4 years later, in 1948, she decided to join her father for a holiday in the south of France. She chartered a small, private de Havilland Dove aircraft to take her from London to Cannes. On May 13, the plane flew into a storm over the French Alps. The pilot, inexperienced with instrument flying, lost control. The plane crashed into a mountainside, killing all on board. Kathleen Kennedy Cavendish died at 28. Another brilliant light in the Kennedy constellation extinguished. Another coffin shipped home to a family that was becoming far too accustomed to them. For Jack, the loss of his beloved sister so soon after his brother was another brutal blow. The world saw the dazzling smile, the wit, the charisma, but those close to him saw the pain, the constant physical ailments he battled with a cocktail of medications, and the deepening understanding of the precariousness of life. He was living on borrowed time, and he knew it. This sense of fatalism seemed to fuel him. He ran for the Senate and won. He married the beautiful and cultured Jacqueline Bouvier, creating a public image of a perfect American fairy tale. But behind the scenes, his health was a carefully guarded secret, and his personal life was fraught with risk-taking and extramarital affairs that defied the moral standards of the era. It was as if he was daring the curse to come for him. In 1954, his health problems nearly did what war and accident had failed to do. His back, injured first at Harvard, and then severely aggravated during the PT-109 incident, was in agonizing condition. He underwent a risky spinal fusion surgery. The surgery led to a massive infection. He was given the last rites of the Catholic Church. The family prepared for another funeral, but against all odds, he survived. During his long, painful convalescence, he worked on what would become his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage. It was another escape, another cheat of death. He was now a senator, a best-selling author, a husband, and a father. The next logical step was the presidency. The Kennedy machine, with his ruthless younger brother Bobby now as its campaign manager, set its sights on the highest office in the land. The 1960 presidential election against Richard Nixon was a historic battle, the first to be heavily influenced by television. The nation saw a young, vibrant, handsome Kennedy against a nervous, sweating Nixon. It was image versus experience, and image won by a razor-thin margin. On a cold January day in 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy stood on the Capitol steps, without a coat or hat in the freezing air, and delivered one of the most iconic inaugural addresses in history. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The words echoed across the nation and the world. The Kennedy era Camelot had begun. The family had reached the pinnacle. They had won, but in the shadow of that brilliant victory, the curse was not sleeping. It was simply waiting for its moment to strike at the very heart of the dynasty. On a sunny day in Dallas, Texas, the White House became a stage, and the young Kennedy family, its radiant players. President John F. Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy embodied a new, modern America, youthful, intellectual, and stylish. They hosted Nobel Prize winners and artists, renovated the White House with historical grandeur, and presented to the world a picture of a vibrant royal court, later immortalized by Jackie herself as Camelot. But behind the glittering facade, the pressures of the curse, or perhaps the consequences of immense ambition and relentless risk-taking, were tightening their grip. The presidency, instead of being a sanctuary from the family's tragic pattern, became its most powerful amplifier. JFK's administration was baptized in disaster. Just 3 months into his term, he greenlit the CIA's ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion, a plan plan inherited from Eisenhower to overthrow Fidel Castro using Cuban exiles. The operation was a fiasco. The promised American air support never materialized. The exile brigade was captured or killed, and Kennedy was left humiliated on the world stage. He publicly accepted responsibility, but privately he was furious, feeling betrayed by the CIA and the military. The curse, it seemed, was no longer a matter of private tragedy, but of global consequence. The first major exercise of his power had ended in catastrophic failure, a stark omen. Then the personal and the political collided in a whisper network of scandal that threatened to unravel everything. The president's chronic health problems, a closely guarded secret, required a daily cocktail of painkillers, amphetamines, and corticosteroids administered by a doctor who would later be dubiously dubbed Dr. Feelgood. This chemical regimen kept him functional, but raised serious questions about his medical fitness for the most stressful job on Earth. More dangerously, his compulsive womanizing continued unabated, a reckless pursuit that flew in the face of his public image. He engaged in affairs with White House interns, staffers, and most notoriously, a woman who was herself a symbol of American fantasy and tragedy, Marilyn Monroe. The connection between the Kennedys and Monroe has become a central, lurid chapter in the curses mythology. Introduced to the president by his brother-in-law Peter Lawford, Monroe became infatuated with JFK. Their affair, though likely brief, was intense. But the deeper, more emotionally fraught relationship was with the younger, more intense brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Bobby, the family's moral compass and enforcer, was tasked with managing the volatile star, a duty that allegedly evolved into its own intimate connection. Monroe, emotionally fragile and struggling with addiction, began to see a future with the powerful Kennedy clan. She famously serenaded the president with a breathy, intimate, "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," at Madison Square Garden in May 1962, an event that scandalized the press and horrified Jackie Kennedy. But to the Kennedys, she was becoming a problem, a loose end that could not be tied. On August 5, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood home from a barbiturate overdose, ruled a probable suicide. The circumstances were immediately shrouded in mystery. Phone records allegedly showed calls to the Justice Department that day. Rumors swirled that both Bobby and Jack had been in Lowe's Angels shortly before her death. Conspiracy theories blossomed, suggesting she was murdered to prevent her from exposing the affairs and revealing state secrets she may have overheard. While no credible evidence has ever substantiated murder, the timing was indelibly sinister. Another luminous life, tangled with the Kennedys, was snuffed out in a haze of drugs and despair. The curse was now claiming souls at the periphery, drawing them into its vortex. The greatest test of JFK's presidency, and a a moment where the world truly stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation came just 2 months after Monroe's death in October 1962. American Humanist-2 spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day confrontation of sheer terror. Kennedy's military advisors, still smarting from the Bay of Pigs, pushed relentlessly for a full-scale invasion of Cuba, an action that would almost certainly have triggered a global nuclear war. Kennedy, tempered by his previous failure, chose a more cautious but firm path of naval blockade and intense back-channel diplomacy. It was here that the lesson of his brother Joe's death perhaps echoed, an understanding of the horrific, irreversible cost of a single, rash military action. After days of unbearable tension, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a secret promise to withdraw American missiles from Turkey and a guarantee not to invade Cuba. The world stepped back from the abyss. Kennedy was hailed as a hero who had faced down the Soviets with cool courage. But within the family, another, quieter horror was unfolding, one that spoke to the patriarch's brutal willingness to protect the family image at any cost. JFK's older sister, Rosemary, had been born with intellectual difficulties and likely suffered from mood swings and seizures. As a young woman, she became increasingly rebellious and unpredictable. In 1941, with the family's political ambitions ascending and fearing her behavior could cause a scandal, Joseph P. Kennedy made a decision that would haunt the family forever. Without consulting his wife, he authorized a lobotomy for his 23-year-old daughter. The procedure, performed at a clinic in Washington, was brutally simplistic and left Rosemary severely disabled. Rendered infantile and incontinent, she was institutionalized for the rest of her life, hidden away from the public eye as if she were a dirty secret. This was not an act of fate, but a deliberate, calculated act of cruelty by the family patriarch. For many, the curse finds its true, non-supernatural origin in such moral choices. The sacrifice of a daughter's mind on the altar of the family's political future, the psychic wound this inflicted on the siblings, especially on Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who would later found the Special Olympics, was profound. We've just navigated through the glitter and the gloom of Camelot, from global crises to hidden family tragedies. This story is as much about secrets as it is about history, and I want to hear your theories. As we gear up for the most infamous moment of all, your perspective is part of this investigation. So please, if you're following this deep dive into the curse, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for the crucial next chapter, and let me know in the comments, what's your theory on Marilyn Monroe's death and its connection to the Kennedys? And don't forget to tell me what city you're watching from. The collective mind of this audience often sees patterns I might miss. By late 1963, John F. Kennedy was a changed man. The near apocalypse of the missile crisis had matured him. He was pushing for a groundbreaking nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviets and was slowly, cautiously, being drawn into the moral imperative of the civil rights movement. Despite the political cost, there was a sense that he was evolving from a cautious cold warrior into a potential peacemaker. But the political climate in America was feverish. His advocacy for civil rights had inflamed the segregationist South. He was due to travel to Texas in November to mend fences within the Democratic Party. On the morning of November 22, 1963, the skies over Dallas were clear. The presidential motorcade wound its way through cheering crowds. Jackie, in her iconic pink suit and pillbox hat, sat beside him. Then, as the open-top limousine turned past the Texas School Book Depository and into Dealey Plaza, the sharp, unmistakable cracks of rifle fire shattered the afternoon. The first bullet struck the president in the upper back, exiting his throat. He raised his hands to his neck. Jackie, in horror, turned towards him. The second, catastrophic shot tore into the right side of his head as his body slumped. She scrambled onto the trunk of the moving car, a moment of stunned animal instinct before being pushed back into the seat by a Secret Service agent. The car sped to Parkland Memorial Hospital. It was too late. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was pronounced dead at 1:00 p.m. the nation, and the world plunged into a paroxysm of grief and disbelief. The young king was dead, murdered in the street. On live television 2 days later, in the basement of the Dallas police headquarters, the alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was himself shot and killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. The shocking, televised murder of the murderer sealed the event in an envelope of endless conspiracy. Was it the Soviets, the Cubans, the CIA, the Mafia, angered by Attorney General Bobby's relentless prosecutions? Or was it, as some whispered, the final, most spectacular payment demanded by the Kennedy curse? For the family, the loss was cataclysmic. The patriarch, Joseph, left severely disabled by a stroke in 1961, received the news in his wheelchair at the family compound in Hyannisport. He let out a long, wordless moan of anguish, the sound of a man who had built an empire only to see its crown jewel violently destroyed. Bobby, the fierce protector, the closest confidant, was utterly gutted. He aged overnight, his eyes carrying a hollowed-out grief he would never shed. The mantle of family expectation, now drenched in blood and shrouded in national mourning, passed to him. He would have to carry his brother's legacy forward, while the curse, having tasted the ultimate prize, turned its hungry gaze onto the next in line. The storm was not over. It had only found its most devastating rhythm. The murder of President Kennedy did not slake the curse's thirst. It merely confirmed its dreadful appetite. The family was now both America's royal family in mourning. And its most tragic spectacle, the weight of legacy, grief, and expectation, fell squarely onto the shoulders of the third son, Robert Francis Kennedy. Bobby was not the natural politician his brother had been. He was more intense, more rigidly moralistic, and privately more tormented. The playful Black Irish charm could vanish in an instant, replaced by a cold, prosecutorial fury. After Jack's death, he was a soul adrift, plunged into what he called an endless, uninterrupted night. Yet, it was from this abyss that he began a profound personal transformation. He softened publicly, connecting with the poor and the marginalized, Black Americans, migrant workers, the disenfranchised young. He seemed to be channeling his monumental grief into a fierce, empathetic populism. By 1968, with the nation by the Vietnam War and civil unrest, Bobby entered the presidential race. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the Kennedy magic, tempered by tragedy, might redeem the decade's chaos. He won the crucial California primary on June 4. In the early hours of June 5, 1968, he walked through the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles to give a press conference. As he turned to leave, a Palestinian immigrant named Sirhan Sirhan, fueled by a fanatical anger over Kennedy's support for Israel, stepped forward with a .22 caliber revolver. The shots rang out. Bobby Kennedy, aged 42, was shot in the head at point-blank range. He died a day later. The nation was numb. Two brothers, two political giants, two assassinations within 5 years. This was beyond statistical misfortune. This was a pattern etched in blood. The curse was not a vague specter. It was a sniper and a pistol claiming heirs with chilling precision. The patriarch, Joseph, now completely incapacitated by his stroke, lingered on, a prisoner in his own body, forced to endure the loss of a third son. He would die in 1969, his dream a smoldering ruin. The sole surviving brother, Edward Ted Kennedy, was now the carrier of the flame. But Ted was already a man marked by his own demons, and a catastrophic error in judgment that would forever bar him from the presidency. Just a year before Bobby's death, in July 1969, Ted had driven his car off a narrow bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, plunging into a tidal channel. He managed to escape. His passenger, 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopchen, a former campaign worker for Bobby, did not. Kennedy did not report the accident for nearly 10 hours. Kopchen died trapped in the overturned car. The incident, and Ted's subsequent handling of it, a guilty plea to leaving the scene of an accident, a 2-month suspended sentence, shattered his reputation. For many, Chappaquiddick was not the curse, but a failure of character. Yet within the family's narrative, it was seen as another manifestation of the relentless pressure and bad luck that dogged them, a self-inflicted wound that nonetheless fit the pattern of sudden, violent death and irreparable scandal. Ted would go on to have a long, influential career as a Lion of the Senate. But the presidency, the family's ultimate goal, was forever out of his reach. The curse, it seemed, had shifted from claiming lives to crippling ambitions, but the 1980s proved it was still hungry for the young. The fourth generation of Kennedys, raised in the long shadow of iconic portraits and whispered horror stories, now came of age without the iron discipline of their grandfather Joe, but with all the wealth, fame, and trauma. Many spiraled into the chaos of addiction and self-destruction. David Kennedy, Robert's fourth son, became the most poignant symbol of this lost generation, haunted by his father's murder, which he witnessed as a 12-year-old. He battled severe drug addiction for years. In 1984, he was found dead of a cocaine and prescription drug overdose in a hotel room in Palm Beach, the family's very seat of power. He was 28. His brother Michael, also dogged by scandal, died in a skiing accident in 1997. Another of Robert's sons, Joseph II, was involved in a car crash that left a passenger permanently paralyzed. The curse was no longer just about gunfire and political violence. It had evolved into a slow-burning fuse of psychological trauma, addiction, and accidental death, consuming the family from within. Then, on a hazy July evening in 1999, the curse reclaimed the spotlight with a devastating, symbolic blow. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., John, the world's most famous little boy saluting his father's coffin, had grown into a man of immense grace and promise. He founded George Magazine, marrying politics and celebrity, and seemed to carry the Kennedy aura with a modern, accessible charm. He was married to the elegant Marilyn, and together they represented a new, hopeful chapter. On July 16, 1999, he piloted a single-engine Piper Saratoga from New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard, en route to a family wedding. His wife and her sister, Lauren Bassett, were aboard. Over the Atlantic, in darkness and hazy conditions, Kennedy, a relatively inexperienced pilot who had not yet earned his instrument rating, became spatially disoriented. The plane plunged into the ocean in a deadly spiral. All three perished. The nation mourned anew. The son who had saluted, the heir to Camelot, was gone not to a conspiracy, but to a simple, tragic error that echoed so many other Kennedy accidents. The symbolism was inescapable. The last direct heir to the Kennedy political throne had fallen from the sky, his legacy extinguished in the deep, cold water that had always surrounded the family's story. As we piece together this final, tragic mosaic of a family's fate, I'm genuinely curious about your final verdict. We followed this shadow from Ireland to Dallas, from Hollywood to Chappaquiddick. The story demands a conclusion, but the discussion doesn't have to end. If this deep dive into history and tragedy has held your attention, please give this video a like to help others find it. Subscribe to the channel for more explorations into history's greatest mysteries. And before we wrap up, I must ask you one more time. Drop a comment below with your ultimate theory. Is it a curse, a statistical anomaly, or the inevitable result of immense pressure and tragic choices? And where in the world are you watching this conclusion from? Your perspective is the final piece of this puzzle. In the 21st century, the tragedies have become quieter, but no less relentless. Maeve Kennedy McKean, Robert F. Kennedy's granddaughter, and her 8-year-old son Gideon died in a canoeing accident in 2020 while attempting to retrieve a ball in the Chesapeake Bay, a heartbreaking echo of the water-related deaths that pepper the family history. Saoirse Kennedy Hill, another of RFK's grandchildren, died of an accidental overdose at 22 in 2019. Legal troubles and scandals continue to surface, a low drumbeat of misfortune. So, what are we left with? A curse implies a supernatural sentence, a doom laid upon a family line. The rationalist points to the laws of probability. A large, risk-taking family in the dangerous arenas of politics and extreme sports will face more tragedy. The psychologist speaks of generational trauma, of children raised in a pressure cooker of expectation and violent loss, leading to self-destructive behaviors. The historian points to the ruthless ambition of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a man who believed he could cheat every system and control every outcome, and the ungodly pressure he placed on his sons to achieve what he could not. Perhaps the true curse of the Kennedys is the intersection of all these things. It is the story of a family that reached for the sun, and in doing so, cast the longest shadow. It is about the price of ambition in a world of random violence and cruel chance. Every family has its pains, but the Kennedys lived theirs on the world stage, their private griefs becoming public myth. The curse is the narrative we construct to make sense of the unbearable, that talent, wealth, beauty, and power are no match for fate's indifference, and that the very forces that propel a family to greatness can also engineer its ruin. The story of the Kennedys is, in the end, a Greek tragedy played out in modern history. It warns that the gifts of the gods, fortune, charm, power, are never free. They come with a terrible tax, extracted across generations, paid in dreams cut short, and lives laid bare on the cold altars of history and happenstance. The shadow remains, a permanent part of the American landscape, a reminder that behind every crown there may lie a thorn unseen, waiting for its moment to draw blood.